This cybersecurity risk assessment for Nations Behaving Badly, Project 2, Step 7, is a contribution by Dawn Salvan and Group 5 members in CYB-670 Capstone in Cybersecurity. This presentation covers cybersecurity risk assessment from the UK perspective with US perspectives intermixed, since both countries share many of the same approaches for identifying and managing risk. Particularly useful in preparation and while the UK and other nations are at the Bye-Bye Summit. The Cybersecurity Risk Assessment Agenda will cover the following topics of security principles as they relate to cybersecurity risk: organizational weakness, which are cybersecurity vulnerabilities, attack vectors, attribution analysis, the vulnerability assessment matrix, and key recommendations. Security principles are the fundamental tenets of the CIA triad, which are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Article 32 of the EU General Data Protection Regulation (GDPR) explicitly states that an organization must risk assess using confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The topic risk assessment will answer what is risk and what is risk assessment, followed by defining the security principles of authentication, authorization, and access control. This slide shows some of the ways to describe what is risk. Using formulas such as the risk equals asset plus or times threat plus or times vulnerability are used to visually explain as well as quantify risk. Based on these formulas, if threats exist, but there are no vulnerabilities, then there is little to no risk. Similarly, a vulnerability can exist, but if there is no threat, then there is little to no risk. Conversely, potential risk is substantial for a valuable asset with both severe vulnerabilities and severe threats. The United States National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST, defines cybersecurity risk as risk is a function of the likelihood of a given threat source's exercising a particular potential vulnerability and the resulting impact of that adverse event on the organization. In other words, risk is the red shaded portion in the illustration where threat and vulnerability for an asset overlap. In the UK, the definition of risk assessment is to identify critical assets, which includes identifying digital technologies and systems critical to business or government. Identifying threats are those which may attack critical assets, and then identifying vulnerabilities is how might assets be vulnerable, according to the UK National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. Risk assessment in general is the process of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating asset threats and vulnerabilities. In the U.S., risk assessment and analysis looks at the overlapping asset threats and vulnerabilities qualitatively or quantitatively to rank their likelihood and severity of impact. Qualitative analysis is the most useful because it captures a wide assortment of knowledge, experience, views, and opinions that subjectively rank risks as low, medium, or high, and sometimes critical. Quantitative risk, popular for high-cost projects, assigns numerical values to risk, which are used to demonstrate risks in terms of cost and/or time. Either method of risk assessment assigns value, probability or likelihood, and potential impact, which can then be matched up with the appropriate level of controls. This slide is an example of risk assessment as a qualitative measure for the probability or likelihood of potential risks as it relates to a vulnerability or compromise of the CIA triad principles. In this example, security objectives that violate confidentiality, integrity, and availability are measured as qualitative values rated as either low, medium, or high risk, described as limited, serious, and catastrophic adverse impact, respectively. Authentication, authorization, and access control. Authentication is user identity verification. It is proof that you are who you say you are. This proof can be in the form of something you know, such as password-based credentials. The use of multi-factor is further proof reinforcing who you say you are by introducing a second factor of authentication known as something you are, where your physical human biometrics are applied for use as another authenticating factor. Technologies that use human biometrics as an authenticating factor can be facial recognition, fingerprints, retinal scanners, to name a few. A third identifying multi-factor would be something you have, such as a logical certificate issued by an authoritative certificate authority and/or applied to a physical USB token, RFID card, fob, or other physical hardware technology independently verified as unique per user, which can be used as another form or proof of identity. Authorization is the next step after authentication. Authorization is the preliminary setting and checking of permission values upon authentication. Authorization establishes privileges through granting rights, which can be based on a cached credential, hash or API, or permission or policy. Permissions can be explicit file, directory, or shared level permissions. Policies can be applied per user or per group to grant or deny access to a resource. Access control is asset security enforcement. Access control categories include discretionary access control, mandatory access control, and role-based access control. DAC, MAC, and RBAC are considered a form of logical access controls designed to restrict access to data. Physical controls physically restrict access, such as gates, fences, man traps, baffles, turnstiles, security guards, and locked doors requiring keys, spin dial combinations, passcodes, and/or swiping or within proximity to a badge or card reader to gain entry. Lines are blurred between logical and physical access controls when logical configurations, such as programmed card readers, password-protected screensavers, BIOS, or other encryption-enabled passwords, can physically block access from gaining entry to use computers. Organizational weaknesses are categorized into people, technology, and policy. Out of all organizational weaknesses, human error is a major factor in breaches. People tend to be the weakest link due to their lack of security awareness, negligence or carelessness, and straight-up disgruntled insiders bent on damage or revenge. External attackers are any unauthorized users who may be motivated either financially, politically, socially, intellectually, or for reasons of their own to commit cybercrimes, such as cyber espionage or other types of cyber attacks. Technology organizational weakness examples would be software or hardware design flaws that could be exploited, such as unpatched software, non-redundant hardware or systems, and poor security practices. Policies that have flawed logic incorporated as rules, regulations, and oversight are a weakness. Some organizational weaknesses are the outdated or outright missing policies. The lack of any cybersecurity policy is a vulnerability because without policies, an organization has no clear guidance or documentation on acceptable internet use, remote access, strong passwords, and routine software updates, all which are required for an effective cybersecurity defense. Attack vectors occur because of vulnerabilities, which exist because of people, technology, and policies. Attacks can be either active or passive. Active attacks are interactive or social engineering types of attack vectors that are a threat to integrity and availability by trying to change system resources or affect their operations. Phishing, spoofing, spamming, malware, session hijacking, and denial of service are examples of active attacks. Passive attacks are those which are a threat to confidentiality. They do not try to change or alter system resources, so they are not as noticeable, but do violate confidentiality by using techniques such as network traffic sniffing, eavesdropping, keyloggers, and password attacks. Attribution analysis. Attribution is difficult to achieve and enforce given cyber attacker abilities to hide their identity behind network complexity, easy anonymity, and user gullibility that enable cyber attackers to exploit vulnerabilities faster than defenders can discover and patch them. The attribution process is the tracking, identifying, and blaming of the perpetrator of a cyber attack. Attribution in some circumstances is used as a deterrence, but attribution does have limitations, and in most cases political implications when trying to hold an attacker and their country responsible. Perpetrator accountability limitations could mean having to disclose or expose confidential details, sources, or techniques to prove attribution. So even with attribution confirmed, any action, punishment, or retribution may not always be worth pursuing if the disclosure damage exceeds sanctions, or worse, strains or inflames friend or foe nation relationships. In most cases, attribution attack analysis is conducted to identify attack vectors. Knowing each type of attack vector or method found in the process of attribution is an advantage towards improving defenses against future attacks. This slide is a sample attribution attack analysis describing types of attack vectors and their goal, or rather malicious intentions. The pertinent attack vectors identified in this attribution attack analysis are phishing, malware, drive-by download, distributed denial of service, domain shadowing, man-in-the-middle, password attack, and SQL injection attack. All of these are insidious attack vectors meant to use exploitation to disrupt and/or exfiltrate sensitive data. The vulnerability assessment is based on the risk assessment process for the US and UK described in the previous slides and was used to generate the following vulnerability assessment matrix content. The vulnerability assessment matrix shown here is a sample of the specific types of attack vectors from the risk assessment process used to categorize and rank each type of attack vector. In this case, attack vectors for each specific vulnerability ranks impact qualitatively as either low, medium, or high risk, followed up with recommended remediation approaches listed in the mitigation column. Most of the vulnerabilities from the risk assessment listed here are caused by well-known third-party vendors who have a potentially exploitable attack vector in their software or firmware due to programming flaws, requiring vendors to promptly issue patches and product updates to remediate. In some of these cases, before patches can be obtained and applied, some vendors recommend alternate mitigations, such as the use of encryption or other authentication validations to delay an attacker's ability from gaining access and/or to exploit the unremediated vulnerabilities. Once risks are ranked, they can then be prioritized for mitigation. Unfortunately, it is not possible to mitigate or eliminate all risks. Instead, the key recommendations are based on the idea to reduce risks to an acceptable, tolerable level within budget. The primary methods to reduce risks are to control or mitigate them, accept risks, or to transfer risks. The cybersecurity risk assessment key recommendations primary focus is on asset security by identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited by threats and attacks. Risk acceptance is the first and somewhat most risky option, which is to do nothing. Although risk is identified, no action is taken to control or reduce the risk, but instead any possible consequences are accepted. A couple of popular risk control and mitigation strategy approaches are RMF and POAMs. Risk Management Framework, RMF, is a risk assessment approach that identifies risk and then applies controls to mitigate exploitable vulnerabilities. Another strategy for risk control and mitigation can be achieved through a plan of action and milestones, POAMs, used in a risk assessment to document specific tasks and timeline required to accomplish vulnerability mitigation or elimination. Another equally important set of interrelated risk controls, which is a subset of RMF and POAMs but worth emphasizing, are the use of public key infrastructure, PKI, and encryption. PKI plays an important role in authentication, where a trusted third party or locally trusted certificate authority provides a certificate for use as another factor of authenticity. Encryption plays an important role in authorization and access control. Simply using encryption or encryption technologies such as Secure Shell SSH and latest transport socket layer TLS SSL protocols will encrypt data at rest and content during its transit so that it is indecipherable for those without authorization or access. Intruders attempting either active or passive attack vectors can be easily filtered out, blocked, or prevented from accessing or viewing content or networks because they do not possess a valid certificate and the encrypted data is unreadable. Risk transference is a risk management strategy that shifts responsibility for the risk from one party to another. For example, insurance or outsourcing is implemented to pass responsibilities and accountability for losses if a compromise or worse security incident occurs onto another party who will manage, mitigate, and compensate for the risk. Cybersecurity risk assessment is the practice of implementing a combination of risk management frameworks and strategies for identifying assets, vulnerabilities, threats, and attack vectors, and then ranking them by severity and/or priority for their mitigation or remediation. Here at the summit, the key recommendations of implementing risk control and mitigation strategies will foster safe communications and help assess and protect networks from risks, threats, and attacks while at the 5i Summit.